It refers to a state of nervous system being out of balance, extremely dysregulated, or you can be just slightly dysregulated.
Hello, this is Douglas Eby, author of the Creative Mind series of sites. That was psychologist Melanie Joy, who notes this is an incredibly dysregulating time for everyone, especially those of us who are highly sensitive. This is an excerpt from her conversation with Andrea Weber for the Sensitive Empowerment Community.
A big focus of the work I do, one of my goals, is to really invite sensitive people into conversations where we can discuss how we as sensitive people can be a part of a solution to creating a better world while staying safe in the process, while staying regulated and balanced ourselves. Dysregulation is the state of your nervous system being out of balance, right? It's basically what happens when we're not managing, or maybe not recovering from our emotional responses in a way that feels balanced or controlled, right? So dysregulation can manifest as anger, fear, intense fear, just overwhelm, irritability, even emotional numbness. Essentially, it refers to a state of being out of our nervous system, being out of balance. Dysregulation also exists a spectrum, right? You can be extremely dysregulated, or you can be just slightly dysregulated. So everybody knows what it feels like to be dysregulated because we're in and out of regulation throughout the day, right? So if people are wondering what exactly is this? Sometimes, just think when you just have an emotional charge, you feel a contraction inside of you. You feel, sensitive people listening to this know exactly what I'm talking about. We feel overwhelmed, overstimulated. Here we are.
Yes.
Right. So, and there are a lot of different factors that can lead to the state of dysregulation. One thing I want to just point out, though, is that it's normal. So often, we start to get dysregulated, or we are dysregulated, or we read about dysregulation. We feel like, oh my God, something's wrong. I have to figure out how to stop this. And yes, it's important to learn how to balance your nervous system. It's important to learn how to self-regulate, regulate. And it's important to acknowledge and appreciate that we're humans, and humans get dysregulated, and sensitive humans especially get dysregulated. And we live in a profoundly, wildly dysregulating world. I think I said this to you last time that we talked. I really believe that if humanity makes it, to the future, people are going to look back and say, how did they get out of bed in the morning? How did you leave your house in this world, right? So various factors can lead to us getting dysregulated. Neurodivergence like ADHD, autism, can impair emotional regulation. It can make it harder for people to emotionally regulate and cause dysregulation. A lot of research has shown that early psychological trauma, and it doesn't have to be trauma with a capital T, is a leading cause. Having a history where you weren't really taught how to self-regulate and you didn't have caregivers who helped you regulate is the main reason, at least what research suggests now, that people, or a leading reason, perhaps the leading reason, depending on what you read, that we can get so dysregulated. Mental health conditions can be dysregulating. Anxiety, depression, for example. Medications can also play an important role in helping us regulate. Physical states like exhaustion, can be dysregulating, and just being highly sensitive, and there's research that really shows or suggests, I should say, that HSPs, experience emotions. We have big emotions and many sensations more deeply, which means that, we're more sensitive to stress. We're more easily overstimulated. So we're much more likely to get thrown out of balance. Our nervous system is much more likely to get thrown out of balance. I think about myself, who's highly sensitive, and my husband who's not, and we walk out the door and there's noise and lights and, God forbid, an interpersonal conflict. And I'm just completely I've got to draw on all of my regulation skills. And he's just what happened? What happened to you? So it's a very different experience. And, having said that, many sensitive people find conflict deeply dysregulating due to their high empathy, sometimes difficulty setting boundaries, and this sense of highly sensitive people, some studies have suggested, tend to be more conscientious, feeling more like an obligation, wanting and needing to be a good person, also more perfectionistic. We tend to, feel that it's our responsibility to cultivate and maintain harmonious relationships. And, the thought of, relational disharmony can be very dysregulating. One thing that I always say to people who are sensitive, particularly, if you notice, I can't tell you how many people have said to me that they're so frustrated with themselves because they've had some sort of an interpersonal conflict and it's like really encroaching on their day-to-day life. I can't get my work done. I can't focus. All I can do is replay this conversation in my mind. Well, you're a highly sensitive person and, and perhaps what I call a highly relational person. And what that means is that relational conflict is probably going to be highly dysregulating for you and bleed into the rest of your life. Give yourself permission to acknowledge that, prioritize like resolving that, tying up that loose end. Give yourself permission to attend to that because you're going to need to, or it's going to keep being in your mind as sort of background noise. And unfortunately, many HSPs have been, told that we're overreacting, right? And so I think, and this is anecdotal, but I really believe that one cause of, I think, the levels of dysregulation that we have among sensitive people is our tendency to not even give ourselves permission to be dysregulated and to judge ourselves like, okay, what's wrong with me? Why am I overreacting? Or, this sort of like emotional or relational perfectionism that we can get into of like, I need to be healthy and balanced. You just give yourself permission to be the hot mess that the rest of the world is. We are all hot messes. Like we've been born into incredible dysfunction. We are sensitive on top of it. We all do the best we can. And, it's our messiness is our beauty, not being perfectly relational beings. So really appreciate that dysregulation is normal, and it's also important to recognize that sometimes you're dysregulated or we're dysregulated because we're really not safe. And this is our body's nervous system telling us something needs to change. I need to find a way to exit this relational dynamic because I'm not being treated in a way that's respectful, for example.
Yeah, I think what you've said there, Melanie, I'm sure so many people can relate to everything that you've just explained there. I know I certainly could. And I think too, with perfectionist tendencies, it's also that fear of what other people are thinking as well, I think.
Right, totally. And on top of that, I'm really glad you bring that up. On top of that, if we're acting in, dysregulation can cause us to act in ways that aren't ideal, then we can say, oh my God, I had an outburst. Like, oh my God, I was like started crying in front of this person. And then we're kind of piling shame on top of, the distress itself. Another potential cause of getting dysregulated or dysregulation is catching it. Like dysregulation is contagious. So dysregulated people dysregulate people, meaning, that when we're around or exposed to people who are dysregulated, we're more likely to become dysregulated ourselves, even if we were in balance beforehand, right? And this is in part because emotions are contagious, especially if you are highly empathic. If you're, and we know this, there's been a lot of interesting research on what's called emotional contagion. And people who are dysregulated tend to act in ways that are dysregulating. They're less likely to be, for example, respectful, or other-centered in their communications. So, sometimes we catch dysregulation from other people without even realizing it. If you're an empathic person, you can just absorb the emotional reality of those around you, take it on as your own, and then think, oh my God, what's wrong with me? When in fact, this didn't even originate with you.
It certainly does take a lot at times to stay balanced and maintain that, that position of balance in these situations. And we're going to talk about some of those through the questions, because there's certainly a lot of different circumstances that people raised for you to answer today, Melanie. So some really interesting questions there. Now, we are in very tumultuous times at the moment. This is causing a great deal of stress for everyone around the world, regardless of where they are. And I know we spoke about distressing media before, but we had a question come in about the fact that people are monitoring and really, I guess, looking at what they're taking in, and they're monitoring that on a daily basis and exactly what they're exposed to. So in terms of our holistic well-being, how can we make a long-term plan around this issue?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I would say to begin with, monitoring is something that you need to do on a regular basis. Like you need to be pretty proactive about it. There's a tendency for like online, most of our media comes from being online. It's online media, right? So digital media. And there's a tendency for digital media or just, being online to be very addictive. In fact, like online media is structured to addict us. And so even if you're being vigilant, there are unseen forces that are working against you. It's like somebody who's being vigilant about eating well, or not drinking. And, that's great. And there are other strategies that you need to put in place so that you don't get pulled back into, witnessing information that's not good for you. So there are a few ways, we can do this. And I just want to point out, like in our last conversation, I talked about, and earlier today, the challenge of being a sensitive person in a violent world, right? And we're especially affected by violence, and chaos and unpredictability, and right now it's just an incredibly dysregulating time, as you pointed out, for everyone. So the question really is like, how do we find the balance, right? So how do we take in enough information so that we can, and I think this is one of the things that does throw people a little bit off because they don't want to just tune out entirely. We need to be informed enough so that we're not a part of the problem by, sticking our heads in the sand. Yeah. But how do we stay informed enough and not get over-informed, and then manage when we do get over-informed? And I think that's a big question. And part of this is just giving yourself permission, like not to consume information that you don't feel is good for you. So for example, I can just share one strategy that I've started doing since, recently, we'll say, is I read news headlines and I don't read articles, unless it's a really necessary article for me. You might even give yourself permission not to read take in any media and assume that whatever's most relevant for you is going to find its way to you, because it usually does. Some distressing information you can avoid, but a lot you can. Sometimes it's actually a matter of having alternatives. So for example, I mentioned that social media or digital media is really designed to pull us back in, even when we try to disengage from it. One way to sort of protect yourself a little bit from getting pulled back in is to get really informed about why you get pulled in the first place. And I don't know if you can relate to this, but I know a lot of people who have made a commitment to step away, and that commitment lasts minutes, hours, maybe days at best. There's a great book called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, and it basically illuminates these unseen forces that are causing us to be addicted to opening up our laptops and picking up our phones. And once you see these forces, and you just really need to remind yourself of it, they're less likely to have power over you. And then provide yourself with alternatives, right? So sometimes we pick up our phones or open our laptops because we're bored, or we're lonely. We've forgotten how to be with ourselves. And we've gotten so used to filling our brains, just filling ourselves with input, whether it's relevant or not, constantly. And I don't know if you can relate to this yourself, but I certainly have struggled with this. And, just this feeling of okay, I'm leaving my office and walking to the kitchen and picking up my phone to see what's on there in the interim. We've lost the ability, many of us have lost the ability to just be quiet and with space in our own thoughts. And so that's something that can be worked on. This is a skill that can be developed. So getting, for example, building mindfulness skills, learning to meditate so that you learn how to be with yourself and to be quiet. And you learn how to notice when there's that part of your brain that's starting to try to convince you to read the news or pick up your phone. And it's not even just reading the news. People can commit to not reading distressing media. But unless we commit to not opening our phones and our laptops, it's going to, as soon as we open them up, something's going to jump out at us because that's the way it's structured. So there's a great app that I recommend called Waking Up by Sam Harris. And it's like a introduction to building awakening and mindfulness practices. And another one that's called The Way by Henry Shookman. And they can be really, really helpful. And on top of this, we can't we're not going to be able to avoid everything, right? And we can't make ourselves dysregulation proof, because we're humans and we're going to get dysregulated and we're going to be exposed to dysregulating information, whether we want to or not. But what we can do, is we can build our resilience so that our distress tolerance is higher, right? So that when we do get hit by that upsetting headline or whatever, we're resilient enough so that it doesn't just suddenly throw us out of balance, or so that we can at least recover more quickly or re-regulate ourselves, more quickly.
Thanks for listening. See the Creative Mind post for this podcast episode with links to resources and other material.